Hey guys, welcome to Everyday Spartan, and today we're going to talk about how to incorporate rock climbing into your training for OCR races, and particularly Spartan races. A little bit about myself. My name is Daniel. I do a lot of OCR running. I qualified for the World Championships of Spartan in my age group for 2019, so I'll be going to Tahoe in 3 weeks. Yeah, so my specialty for OCR in particular is obstacle training, particularly the obstacles where you are climbing or having to get over objects, because my background does come from rock climbing. So these are some of the things that I'm strongest at, which is why I think I'm pretty well qualified to talk to you guys about how you want to incorporate this. So just as an outline for the video today, we're going to talk about why you want to do rock climbing, why it gives you benefits, and why it's probably one of the best things you can possibly do when preparing for OCR. Then we're going to talk about what you need to get started before you go into the gym at all, what you want to do once you get into the gym, and what you want to be doing at the end of your workouts to make sure you're stretching out and recovering properly. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. First things first, obviously we want to talk about just some of the benefits that rock climbing gives you, and there's a lot across the board. As you can imagine, when you are climbing, it is very helpful with obstacles that involve climbing on walls. Particularly, a lot of the benefits are just the musculature that you're going to gain, so it's really good for improving your grip, your forearms. You'll also be working your biceps, your back, and your core a lot. So these are all like primary muscles for movements that are involved in OCR, and it's going to help in pretty much every obstacle that you're doing. Another big benefit that you gain from rock climbing versus doing things like pull-ups, for example, is you also are moving your body through space. You're gaining a lot of spatial awareness about how to move your center of mass, how to keep momentum going, and how to travel as you are on the wall or at an odd object. So for example, a lot of the times you see people who are at obstacles like monkey bars, where they should have the strength to get through it, but what happens is they may be swinging and then they'll come to a dead stop and lose all their momentum, and then before they can get their momentum back, they fall. So what really happened is they were plenty strong enough that they kept the momentum going, they'd be fine, but they didn't learn how to handle momentum in moving through spaces like that by doing pull-ups. It's only something you can gain by going out there and doing it and getting practice on it, which is why rock climbing is such a great advantage. Rock climbing is just low impact. There's very easy to get injured while you're running, for example, because your feet are hitting the ground so often and doing a lot of other training exercises. As you can imagine, if you're climbing up, there's not really places where you're doing hard impacts with the wall. So for the most part, it's something very easy that you can do even on days where you're trying to prevent injuries in other areas. And the last thing is, it's just a more fun way to train than doing things like pull-ups again. Because when you go into a gym, typically we call all of the routes that you can do in bouldering problems. And what you're trying to do when you go in and get up the route is it's called solving the problem. So it's a lot of interesting ideas of like you just trying new ways to get through a problem, you making problems harder, and really just letting your creativity run wild and have a more fun experience while climbing. And you're gonna have a much better time, I think, climbing over a lot of different types of training. So now that I've motivated some of the climbing a little bit and talked about why it's so important, we're going to talk about what you want to do when you get started. So there are really two primary types of climbing. There's top roping, and then there's bouldering. So top roping, for example, is where you actually have a harness on, you're tied into a rope, and you're climbing up very high or steep walls. Bouldering is much different. It's where you actually don't have a rope or harness on. Instead, you just have crash pads under you. And the way you get around this is you usually only climb a short period of distance so that the fall from it would be safe to land on the crash pad with. And bouldering is actually what I suggest you get into, just because it has a far lower barrier of entry, and you won't have to learn all of the extra safety precautions about rock climbing. So everything I'm gonna say is pretty applicable to rock climbing in particular, but I am gonna talk specifically about bouldering for the rest of the video. For when you're getting into bouldering, the number one thing you wanna do is look for a gym near you. This is probably the biggest obstacle and really the only obstacle to you getting into climbing itself. But most major cities should have a gym in them or in some kind of driving distance that's reasonable for people to go to. So this should be a pretty reasonable thing for you to do, and the benefits are definitely going to make it worth it. The next thing you want to start doing, obviously, is looking at gear. And there's really only two pieces of gear you want to consider for bouldering getting early on, and these are shoes and then chalk. So talking a little bit about shoes, most gyms should have shoe rentals there, so you don't really have to worry about purchasing shoes right away. You can try out bouldering maybe for a month, see how you like it, and then invest in shoes. I personally didn't get shoes until after I've been climbing for a full year, so it's definitely not necessary to have one. You can just rent the ones. Although I will say that generally these shoes are worse, so you probably will specifically want to purchase shoes of your own as soon as you can. We're going to talk about, these are the shoes I have. The brand is La Sportiva. They're a very common brand in rock climbing. You can see right away that these are pretty tiny. You want your rock climbing shoes to be very tight on your feet. You want your heel to be hitting the back and your toes to be hitting the front. The reason for this is when we climb, usually we do what we're called toeing holds. So instead of putting the middle of your foot on a hold, you're just putting your toe. And having tight feet lets you more finely control where you're placing your feet. So it's pretty important to have a good tight shoe. The big thing you may be noticing about this shoe is how flat it is. That's because this is what's called a moderate shoe. Rock climbing shoes go from moderate to aggressive, and pretty much moderate shoes are nice and flat, while aggressive shoes will be bent. They'll look something kind of like this, where you'll have your foot scrunched in and it's just like toed out with a sharper toe on the end. Typically, aggressive shoes are considered to be better because they allow you to toe holds more easily, but the downside is they are not very comfortable. I know people with aggressive shoes and they have to take the shoe off between routes just to be able to climb for the number of hours that they climb. On the flip side, I have a more moderate shoe, which is far more comfortable. It's because I will sometimes go into the gym for up to like 3 hours at a time, and I don't want to be constantly taking my shoe on and off just to be able to make it to the end. But on the downside, it is a little harder to toe holds than aggressive shoes. Anyone beginning, you will not really notice the difference between moderate and aggressive shoes when you first start climbing. Really, the big benefit is just getting a pair of your own shoes with a nice grip on them. So what I personally recommend is moderate shoes. After you've been climbing for a few years, or the shoes that you have wear out, you can consider moving to a more aggressive shoe if you want. But I think the first shoe you get should be a moderate one. So that was all about shoes, and now we're going to talk about chalk. Chalk bags, again, are pretty much just bags you will have that you fill with a nice fine powdered chalk, and the whole point of it is it just dries your hands out and keeps them dry. Again, this is something you should expect your gym to have either rental or provided when you go in, but there are some places that do not offer it, so you may want to consider getting your own bag. But chalk is 100% optional, not necessary at all. I personally don't climb with chalk for reasons that we'll get into later, but in general, chalk is totally optional. So really, when you're looking at the things that are mandatory to have, you really only need the gym membership. The shoes and chalk you can get later if you decide you want them. All right, so now we've covered all the requisites of what you want to know before you go into the gym, and now we're going to talk about getting into the gym itself, right? So the number one thing climbing and bouldering is just general safety. We're going to go over it a little bit first, just because you do want to make sure that you're being as safe as possible when you are climbing up and down these obstacles. The big thing is pretty much just how you're going to fall. Falling is the only really risky part of climbing. You'll usually be doing this when you're at the top of the route and you want to get down quickly, or you just accidentally miss a hold. Falls happen to everyone, so it's just important to know how to fall safely. So in the video that you're watching right now, what you'll be seeing is me at the top of a route falling down, and what you should notice is I don't actually just plop down and land on my feet. My feet hit the ground, and then I immediately roll back onto my butt, and then I roll all the way back down onto my back. This helps dissipate some of the energy from the fall so that it's not all going directly into one joint. And landing on your back keeps any of your limbs from like getting pushed too hard and hitting yourself. So the big injuries that I've seen from people falling are actually just from them trying to land on their feet, but they land so hard, their face comes down and hits their knee. And it's really not comfortable to be kneed in the face. So you just want to make sure you're falling down by rolling out and landing on your butt. It may look a little silly, but it is the safest way to get down from a route. The only other big safety concern is just if you see someone else climbing, don't try getting under them, because if they wind up falling or they want to come down at some point, you don't want to be directly under them and have them fall under you. And this also goes for if you're climbing and you're about to drop down somewhere, try and make sure that no one is under you. Just give yourself a good courtesy check and everything should be good. Now that we've gotten all the boring safety stuff out of the way, we can finally get to the actual climbing itself. The first thing you'll want to understand is there's a grading system for routes. Gradings start at V0 and they increase V1, V2, V3, and it just increases. I've personally seen routes as high as V9, but I do know that there are definitely higher than V9s at other places. Just as a point of reference, I'll talk about what you should expect. So when you're starting off, If you are no good at climbing and you have really no experience with those muscle groups, you should expect only to really be climbing V0s on your first day in the gym. If you have some kind of strength already there, you can expect to be climbing V1s. So V0s and V1s are really what you're going to expect to be on for a little while. And then anywhere between 2 weeks and a month, depending on how long you've been in the gym, you should expect to go up to V2s. And then maybe after another month or two of climbing, I would expect you to be up at V3s. And then after that, progress starts really slowing down for how you increase in grading. So for example, I've been climbing for over 2 years now, and I'm currently at a V6, and I'm working on getting into V7s. So it takes quite a few years to get there. Just remember to take it slow and steady and do the routes that you can early on. So now we're gonna talk a little bit about just some of the tips that I have for climbing. We're not gonna go into specific techniques because this is just an intro video. Really the best thing you can do to learn to climb is just to get in there and get on some routes. But there are a few general tips that I think are helpful to most people. The number one thing is use your legs to push yourself up on the wall. So a lot of the time people go into a route trying to muscle up with their arms. This is very indicative of like males who try climbing because they want to just do pull-ups the whole way through. And you can do just pull-ups if you want, but it is generally a lot harder. Your legs can do a lot more power, which is why girls actually tend to be a little better than guys right when they start climbing, because girls already generally have a better sense of balance and coordination. And when you add that with the fact that they're more willing to use their legs, they usually have a much better improvement early on. So make sure that you're pushing up with your legs. The general rule I've heard is your arms are only there to keep you onto the wall, so your arms are pulling into the wall. Your legs are what should be pushing you up. The next thing is keep your hips into the wall. This really is addition to the first tip, but when you keep your hips close to the wall, your arms won't have to work as hard to pull you on towards the wall because your center of mass is just closer to that pivot point wherever your feet are. And because all of your mass is directly over your feet, it makes it easier for your legs to push you up. So at any point in time, if you're just climbing one of these lower grades like 0s to 2s and you're having a hard time, one of the best tips you can probably have is just think, how can I get my hips closer to the wall? And the third tip is try climbing statically. So when you're rock climbing, there are generally two types of moves that people can consider: static moves and dynamic moves. Static moves are where you're maintaining 3 points of contact with the wall as you grab your next hold. So for example, if I have all 4 of my limbs on the wall and I remove my right hand, my left hand and 2 feet should both stay on the wall and not move as I go to grab my next hold, right? So basically, as you climb statically, you want to make sure you're maintaining 3 points of contact all the way up. The reason this is generally good is because it's a very stable way to traverse a wall, and it's very consistent. You're not going to have routes where you can do it, but you just miss a hold or something like that. So generally static climbing is considered better. The downside of static climbing is it requires a lot of strength. On the other hand, dynamic climbing is a lot more jumpy. You're going to be jumping for holds. You might take 2 points of contact or more off of the wall. And while this can be advantageous because it makes things a little more energy efficient, it's generally considered less consistent, less stable. And because you're going to the gym to work out, usually doing static climbing is better. And also, as you get to the higher levels, people who can do things statically are typically considered some of the better climbers because it takes more skill, more strength, and more endurance to do. So if you want to improve very quickly early on, I would highly recommend trying to climb as statically as possible. And that gets us into workouts and drills that you can do in the gym. So these are just some of the things that you can do other than just climbing routes to help improve specific areas of climbing. When you're going into the gym, at least for the first month, just climb. You don't need to do any particular drill. You're gonna get very strong, very fit, very quickly early on, just by climbing and doing the grades that you think you can. That being said, if you want to get to a point where you start improving or focusing on something in particular, I do have 4 drills that you guys can work on here. The first one is my favorite drill, which is a lock-off strength exercise. So going back to what I was saying about static climbing, when you climb statically, you have at least 3 points of contact. Well, when you have 3 points of contact and one hand is off the wall, this position is what's known as a lock-off. So when you're climbing, you can focus on having longer lock-offs, which involves getting more strength and having to be very stable on the wall. It forces you to be stable. So when I climb, a lock-off strength exercise would be something where I'm on the wall and I remove one limb and I hold it over the hold for a set number of seconds. This means I have to be very stable. I can't just be moving in passing by the hold and grabbing it, I have to actually be able to hold my hand over it. So I'll hover my hand over it, I'll wait for 2 to 3 seconds, I'll grab it, and then I move my feet however I want, and I try going for my next lock off. And I basically continue this for the whole route, and it's really good at working your strength and getting you closer to being a more static climber, which I already said is very beneficial. The next thing is the traverse. So traversing is where you pretty much go across the wall, and this is very good for endurance climbing. So what I like to do is, our wall is pretty much just one continuous loop, so I will climb from one corner and climb the entire wall to the side and see how few attempts it takes me to get across. So this has a lot of benefits just for endurance, and you can get very creative because I generally just allow myself to use any color holds I want to get across. So typically it gives you a lot more creativity that you can do and helps work some of that endurance strength, which you'll be seeing in some of these races because you'll be climbing while you're fatigued. Another workout that's a favorite of mine is something called campusing. So campusing is where you cut your feet, which is just remove your feet from the wall, and climb up a route completely with your arms. So as I said before, your legs should be doing most of the lifting, so if you want to particularly work your upper body, you can just campus. I did this a lot when I was a very new climber, and I still do this a good bit, like at least once a week, where I'll pretty much just try climbing a hold. It's very good for working that upper body strength and endurance, and you can usually find creative ways to do routes that you haven't done before. Typically, the only note I'm going to say about campusing is if you do it, try to do these in overhangs or caves at the gym, because if you do this on a flat wall, your feet are just going to be rubbing against the wall and it's going to be uncomfortable. If you do it where there's an overhang, you can have the hold above you and you can just be pulling up and your feet can dangle below without having to worry about bumping it into anything. I will say, particularly for Spartan racing, this is probably one of the most beneficial workouts you'll be able to do that I've said, other than just the walk-off strength, because so many of the obstacles that you do involve having your feet completely off the ground, and you're doing monkey bars or beater or multi-rig. It's just a bunch of different movements where you have to be using only your hands, and it's going to be very beneficial for that. The last one is favored by Mike, and it's just down climbing. So down climbing is where you've already climbed all the way up a route, and instead of just jumping down or dropping, you can climb all the way down. So there's two main benefits to this. The first one is you get to do the route backwards, which gives you eccentric workout. So instead of ascending, you're now working your muscles and trying to slow yourself as you go down. You're getting to work out the muscles in a new way for longer, and so typically it should lead to better strength gains. Also, the other benefit is it helps turn the low impact of climbing into even lower impact, because instead of dropping down, now you will climb all the way down on the route, and it can help really give you some endurance when you're climbing. So that's pretty much everything you need to know in the gym itself. That's what you'll be doing for the most part while you're climbing. And the last thing I want to talk about is just how to prevent injuries in the gym, because obviously if you can prevent injuries, then you can be climbing more frequently and for longer, and generally be able to do things more safely so that you're not put down due to some kind of injury. There's 3 types of injuries that I'm going to talk about that I think are the most common. Obviously, there's a few other ones that can crop up while you're climbing, but these are the main three things that I've seen. So the first one is the most common one for people, and it's just ripping calluses. Basically, as you climb, you should expect your hands to get a lot more rough as calluses form. And if you aren't careful, as you climb too much, the rest of the skin around them won't have time to toughen up, and you'll pull an entire callus off. This is a very beginning climber injury. You don't see this so much as people continue climbing at higher grades, but early on you should expect to lose some calluses. It's not exactly fun, and it can make your hands very sensitive for a little bit of time, but it's definitely something you just have to get through, and everyone has to kind of deal with. There's 3 ways that you can minimize ripping out calluses that you can try if it's really concerning. The first one, which is the one I don't recommend, is a lot of people get climbing grips. So basically they're just gymnastic grips that you would have around your hand to protect particularly this part of your hand. That is not as great because you're just putting off the development of calluses until a later date. If you embrace like toughening your hands up early on, then eventually you'll get there. So I see a lot of people at Spartan races who run with gloves. If that's what you have to do to finish the race, more power to you. But I think in the long run, it's more beneficial to train and then perform at races without gloves. Typically, you're going to have a lot better contact with whatever you're dealing with, and you're going to toughen your hands up to the point where you don't have to worry about calluses being ripped out enough. Another way to prevent calluses from ripping out is do not use lotion on your hands. A lot of people use lotion because their hands start getting hard and rough and they want to soften them up, but the downside of this, again, is you're just softening your hands back up so that the calluses can rip out. You want your hands to harden and get tough and get those layers of skin so that you can climb without them ripping out at all. I think it's a benefit to have these thick calluses, and so you don't want to be using lotion and getting rid of them. And the last way to preventing calluses is don't use grip chalk. So chalk, a lot of the time, it's good because it dries your hands out. It keeps you from sweating so much. But on the downside, the drying out your hands makes it very easy for your skin to crack and for calluses to be ripped off. So if you want to minimize the amount of calluses you have, you can just use less chalk. Generally, if that's something that appeals to you, you can avoid using grip chalk. I don't use grip chalk for that reason, and because grip chalk is not allowed at Spartan races, and I want to train as if I'm at a Spartan race. Those are just some of the ways you can help minimize the formation of calluses, but really there's something you're going to have to embrace. No matter what you do, you will get some if you're climbing at enough to see significant gains. The next kind of injury is one that is also very common. This is people tearing tendons in their fingers. So obviously, as you're climbing and pulling a lot, and there's a lot of strain pushing the other way, you can very easily see injuries form in the form of tears. Really, this is the only way to minimize this risk of injury is to just not climb too much too quickly. And this applies to pretty much every type of workout. You shouldn't do too much volume too early on. When you're first climbing, I would only expect you to be going 1 to 2 times a week. Personally, I'm barely starting to get into 4 times a week, and even then, it's very new and I'm considering going back down to 3 times a week. You don't want to be doing too much volume, and try minimizing your climbing sessions to somewhere, an hour to an hour and a half tops. And as you eventually get later on, you can increase the length of time. By the time I was climbing for a year, I would climb twice a week at 3 hours each time, and even then that might have been a little too much. So just take it nice and easy. You're going to get there slow and steady, and it's about doing things successively over the course of months and preventing injuries. One of the things you're going to hear early on when you start climbing is people are going to talk about how great using fingerboards are as well. Fingerboards are pretty much it's a block of wood with holes in it, and the holes are made for getting like 2 fingers in, or maybe 4 fingers, but only like 1 full pad in or something like that. Basically made for you to work different fingers, different amounts of fingers, and different length in there. Basically just hang from it or do pull-ups from it. These can be great. You'll get a lot of benefits for grip strength, but they have a very high risk of injury and a high rate of injury, and it's not something you want to do early on. You're going to get plenty strong just climbing, just doing your thing and going to the gym. You do not need to use a fingerboard. Typically, I would only recommend using fingerboards if you have at least a year of rock climbing under your belt. Before then, it's useless, and even then, you don't really need it at any point. I don't use fingerboards, and I've been climbing for over 2 years, and I'm perfectly fine. I'm still making plenty of progress. Typically, what I've seen is people fingerboard once they start getting around the V7 and they want to start moving into like V8s. And that's the point where you actually need them. Before that, really, you're just going to risk too much injury for how much stress is putting on your body, so it's not worth the potential gains. Just stay away from fingerboards, even though a lot of people are going to recommend them. So those are the main ways to prevent tearing a tendon. And the last injury you can see is there's something called climber's elbow, which is something that I suffered from a good bit because I was climbing incorrectly. But climber's elbow is it's very similar to a shin splint, but in your elbow instead of your shin. So you form a lot of muscle in your forearms right here as you climb successively, and you usually aren't working the back side of your forearms nearly as much. So what this does is it creates an imbalance, and you're pulling these muscles a lot harder back towards the front, and this causes them to slightly tear off the bone, which is similar to what a shin splint does, and it just causes a very dull, throbbing, like kind of aching every time you climb. So a good way to prevent this is just making sure you're working out the back of your forearm. There's quite a few things you can do. The first thing that I was introduced to is I have a dumbbell routine. So this is like a 5-pound dumbbell. You don't want to go heavyweight with it, but you can pretty much just take it and just do these raises. And the point is you want to be feeling this muscle right here tighten. You can also be rotating this. And again, you want to be feeling a tightening back here somewhere. So this is just strengthening the back end of your muscle and making sure that you're making some kind of strength gains and not having a total imbalance there. Another thing you can do is after every single time you climb, you can stretch out those forearms by doing things like rice buckets. So a lot of climbing gyms will have just a bucket full of rice, and the goal is you put your finger in, you spread your fingers out, and that spreading out is what's working out the forearm, and then you just pull it out with the fingers spread out. If this isn't something your gym offers, you can easily make a rice bucket for like $10. Rice is plenty cheap, and those buckets you can get at Home Depot for basically nothing. So it's really easy to get one, and it's definitely worth it because it helps prevent injury in the long run. Just every single time you finish climbing, shove your hands in there, stretch them out, and you'll be right as rain. Something that I personally use as well is I have resistance bands particularly made for climbing. So they pretty much are the same as the rice bucket. They have little holes for your finger, and you just spread them out, and it's the spreading out of your fingers against the resistance band that's doing all the work and giving you all of the extra gains in the back of your forearms. So this is going to help prevent that elbow tinnitus that you're going to see forming if you climb too much without working the backside of that climbing. Those are some of the main injuries I've personally seen. I'm sure there are more that you want to keep an eye out for, but in general, as long as you're making sure you're stretching out your arms and everything after you climb and doing particularly those exercises that I mentioned, you should be fine for climbing without really risk of injury, because again, you're not expecting any kind of impact injuries from it. That's pretty much everything I have to say about climbing, guys. I really want to thank you guys for listening. So today we talked about why you want to be climbing, what you need before you go into the gym, what you generally want to be doing in the gym, and rates of progression that you expect to be seeing, as well as workouts that you should be doing if you want to improve a particular area of climbing. And then finally, the things you want to be doing at the end of your climbing session, just to make sure you're preventing injury and not risking having to be put down. I really appreciate you guys watching. If this video does well, I will definitely do a video later on that maybe is particularly climbing techniques and stuff like that. But for now, I think this is a good introduction for anyone to go ahead and get started and just explore climbing. You should definitely try it out. Personally, I think that if you run, you climb, and you do a little bit of weightlifting for the carries, you are fully prepared for an obstacle course race. There's nothing else you need to do. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you want to see more content like this, I post every week. Feel free to subscribe, and I will see you guys later.